My stepmother stood up in the middle of my father's funeral reception, tapped a spoon against a wine glass like she was about to announce an engagement, and said, "Now that Harold's gone, it's time we talked about who's actually going to run the company." Half the room turned to look at me. I hadn't even taken off my dress uniform yet. 3 hours earlier, I'd been standing over a casket. Now I was standing in my father's living room, watching the woman he married 4 years ago smile at a room full of mourners like she'd just won something. I want to back up, because you need to understand who Denise was before you understand what she did. My name is Marcus. I'm a colonel 22 years in, 2 deployments, and I thought after all that, nothing could rattle me. I was wrong. Nothing prepares you for watching someone circle your father's death, like it's a business opportunity. My father, Harold Webb, built a precision machining company from a 2-car garage in 1987, Webb Fabrication. By the time I was in high school, it had 40 employees. By the time I left for the academy, it had contracts with 3 defense subcontractors. My father built that company with his hands, with his back, with 30 years of 6 a.m. mornings. My mother helped him build it too, until cancer took her when I was 26. My father grieved her for 6 years. Then he met Denise at a charity dinner, and 18 months later, they were married. I didn't hate her at first. I want to be honest about that. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, because that's what you do when your father is happy and you're stationed 900 miles away and you don't get to see him more than 4 times a year. She was younger than my father by 11 years, sharp, well-dressed, good at making a room feel like a party. At the wedding, she hugged me and told me she knew she could never replace my mother and that she wasn't trying to. For a while, I believed her. But the first real conversation I ever had with Denise, alone, without my father in the room, happened about 4 months after the wedding, at a dinner she'd planned while my father was in the shower. She looked at me over a glass of white wine and said, "You know, Marcus, your father's worked so hard. It's a shame he has to keep worrying about that company instead of enjoying his retirement. Someone with real business sense should be running it. Not that I'm saying you couldn't learn." I remember exactly where I was sitting. I remember the way she said learn, like it was a favor she was offering me. I asked her what she meant by real business sense, and she just smiled and said she'd worked in marketing for 15 years before she met my father, as if that answered the question. It didn't. What she meant, I understood later, was that she'd already started measuring the company in dollar signs before she'd finished unpacking her boxes into his house. That was the villain's first line. She never raised her voice. She never called me stupid. She just made it very clear, very early, that in her mind, I was in the way. I said nothing that night. I finished my drink. I hugged my father goodbye. I flew back to base the next morning. That was how I handled Denise for 4 years. Not today. Not this trip. Not at Dad's table. People think restraint is weakness. It isn't. Restraint is what lets you keep your eyes open long enough to actually see what's happening. And here's what I saw, over those 4 years, in the small moments nobody photographs. I flew home on every leave I could get, sometimes just for a weekend, just to sit with my father in his shop and hand him wrenches like I did when I was 9 years old. I paid for the roof repair on his house in 2019 because Denise said the company couldn't spare the cash flow that quarter, even though the company had just landed a $2 million contract. I sat with him in the hospital in March, the first time his heart gave him trouble, for 6 straight nights, sleeping in a chair, while Denise came by for 40 minutes with a bouquet from the gift shop downstairs and left before visiting hours ended. I learned his medications. I learned his doctors' names. I called the pharmacy myself when his insurance tried to deny a refill. I sat with him and filled out his advance directive, because he asked me to, not her. I did this. I drove 4 hours after a full week of drills to sit in a waiting room. I did this. I paid a roofer out of my own savings and never told him. I did this. I learned to cook the low-sodium meals his cardiologist wanted, and I made them in his kitchen on weekends, and I labeled the containers in the freezer so Denise wouldn't have to think about it. I did this. I sat with him on his back porch every Sunday I could manage, going over invoices he didn't trust anyone else to check, because his eyesight was going and he was too proud to say so out loud. I did this. I called Rosa, his office manager, every other Friday just to ask how he'd seemed that week, whether he'd eaten lunch, whether he'd taken his afternoon walk, because I couldn't be there and I needed someone I trusted watching. I did this. I flew home for his 70th birthday and spent it in his garage helping him restore an old lathe instead of at whatever dinner Denise had booked at a restaurant downtown, because he told me, quietly, that the garage was where he actually wanted to spend it. I did this, and I never once mentioned it to him, Because love that keeps score isn't love, it's an invoice, and Denise was the one running a tab. Because here's what Denise did in those same 4 years. She redecorated the master bedroom twice. She took 2 trips to Europe, both times leaving my father home because the travel would be too hard on his heart, and both times posting photos captioned things like living my best life while my father sat in his recliner alone. She told the housekeeper my father hired to reduce her own hours to twice a month, then told my father she was handling everything herself. She asked him, more than once in front of me, when he was going to formally bring her into the business, and every time he changed the subject. She joined a country club 40 minutes from the house and told people at dinner parties that she helped run a manufacturing company, though I never once, in 4 years, saw her set foot on the shop floor during business hours. She bought herself a new car the same month my father postponed a knee replacement he badly needed, because, she said, the timing wasn't right for the company. The company had $1,100,000 in its reserve account that quarter. I know, because I asked to see the books, and Rosa showed me without hesitation. My father was many things, but he was not a fool. He just loved people generously, and generosity has a blind spot. I think some part of him knew. I think that's why, 18 months before he died, he called his old college roommate, a man named Arthur Kessler, who happened to be an estate attorney in Ohio, and asked him to fly out and have a private conversation. I didn't know about that meeting until much later. Nobody did. My father passed in his sleep on a Tuesday in April. Heart failure, the same heart that had been warning him for years. I flew home on emergency leave. I was the one who found out first, because the hospice nurse had my number programmed into her phone under call first. Denise was at a spa appointment when it happened. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because I did. The funeral was on a Saturday. 200 people came. Men my father had employed for 30 years stood in the back in their good suits, crying like they'd lost their own father, because in a lot of ways, they had. Denise wore black Chanel and greeted people at the door like she was hosting a gala. And then, at the reception afterward, in my father's own living room, with his ashes still in an urn on the mantel he built with his own hands, Denise tapped that wine glass. Now that Harold's gone, she said, smiling at the room, it's time we talked about who's actually going to run the company. I've spoken to a few people already, and I think, given everything I've contributed these past years, it only makes sense that I step into a leadership role. Marcus has his military career. I'm sure he understands. A few people laughed, uncomfortable, thinking it was some kind of dark joke. It wasn't. She meant it. She had, I later learned, already called the company's office manager that Thursday, 2 days before her own husband's funeral, to ask about transition logistics. I didn't say anything at the reception. I just looked at her, and I said, "We can talk business another day, Denise. Today we're burying my father." She smiled at me the way you'd smile at a child who'd said something naive, and she said, quietly, just for me, "Marcus, sweetheart, I think you'll find there's a lot about this business you don't know." She had no idea how right she was. The following Wednesday, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Arthur Kessler. He introduced himself, told me he'd known my father since 1979, and asked if I could come to his office. Alone. He was very specific about that. Alone. I sat across from him in a small office that smelled like old paper and coffee, and he slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a document my father had signed 18 months earlier, notarized, witnessed, filed. It was the formation paperwork for something called the Harold Webb Irrevocable Legacy Trust. Arthur explained it to me slowly, like he could tell I was still in shock from the week I'd had. My father hadn't just left me the company in a will. A will, Arthur told me, is a request. It goes through probate. It can be contested, delayed, picked apart by lawyers for years while the business bleeds out. My father knew that. My father had watched 2 friends lose their companies to exactly that kind of drawn-out estate war. So instead, 18 months before he died, my father had transferred full ownership of Webb Fabrication into an irrevocable trust. Not a revocable trust, which can be changed or dissolved. Irrevocable. Once it was signed, my father himself couldn't have undone it, not even if he wanted to. The trust named me as sole beneficiary and successor trustee, effective automatically upon his death. No probate required, no court approval needed. Denise's name did not appear anywhere in that document. Not as a beneficiary. Not as a trustee. Not as an officer. Nothing. Arthur told me my father had said one thing to him when he signed it, and I've never forgotten it. My father said, "I love her, Arthur. But love and trust aren't the same account. He built her a life. He didn't build her a company." I asked Arthur why my father never told me. He said my father didn't want me carrying the weight of that secret while he was alive, watching Denise, waiting. He wanted me to grieve him honestly, not strategically. That was so exactly like my father that I sat in that office and cried for the first time since the hospital. I didn't tell Denise right away. I let her keep making calls. I let her keep believing. 2 weeks after the funeral, she asked me to meet her for coffee. I knew what it was going to be before I sat down, because she'd already had her assistant email me a folder labeled Transition Plan. She slid a printed document across the table, an outline of a new leadership structure with her name at the top, under a title she'd invented for herself, Executive Chair. "I know this is a lot," she said, "but I think it's time we're practical. I've been at your father's side for years. I understand this business better than you think. And frankly, Marcus, the employees need stability, not a colonel who's going to be shipped off to God knows where in 6 months." I asked her what she thought would happen if I simply said no. She smiled, and her voice dropped into something colder, something I'd been waiting 4 years to hear out loud. "Then I suppose we have to let the lawyers sort out your father's estate the hard way. That can take years, Marcus. And, in the meantime, the company needs someone making decisions. I could make this very easy for you or very difficult. Your choice. 15% of the company, a generous consulting fee, and you go back to your base and let the adults handle the rest. 15% of a company my father built with his own hands that I had spent 4 years of leave time helping him hold together. She wasn't offering me a partnership. She was offering me a bribe to disappear. I asked her, calmly, what exactly she believed entitled her to any percentage at all. She set her coffee cup down and looked at me like the question offended her. I was his wife, Marcus. For 4 years I ran that household so he could focus on that company. I planned every dinner, every event, every appearance he made in front of clients. You think that doesn't count for something? I thought about the freezer full of labeled containers I'd made myself. I thought about the 6 nights in a hospital chair. I didn't say any of it out loud. I just let her keep talking, because people who are lying to themselves usually keep going until they say something they can't take back. She did. She leaned forward, lowered her voice like she was doing me a favor, and said, "You were her charity case too, you know. Your mother's, I mean. Harold told me once he almost didn't marry your mother, that some part of him always felt like he was rescuing her. I just assumed the same instinct carried over to you, the good son who shows up, so everyone feels sorry for him." I sat very still. 22 years in uniform teaches you how to keep your face empty when someone hands you something ugly. I didn't answer her. I just paid for the coffee, both cups, and stood up to leave. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "You should talk to Arthur Kessler before you send that transition plan to anyone else." She blinked. "Who?" "My father's attorney," I said. "He'll explain everything." I let her find out the hard way, because some truths land harder when you discover them yourself instead of being told. She found out 3 days later, sitting in Arthur's office, the same chair I'd sat in. Arthur told me afterward that when he explained the trust to her, explained that she had no legal claim to the company, no seat, no shares, nothing, she went very pale, and then very angry, and accused him of helping my father hide assets from her. Arthur, calm as ever, told her that everything had been disclosed properly at the time of the marriage in their prenuptial agreement, which she herself had signed, which explicitly excluded Webb Fabrication and all its future value from marital assets. She had signed away her own claim for years earlier and never bothered to understand what she was signing. She didn't accept it quietly. 2 weeks later, the company held its first all-employee meeting since my father's death, in the main floor of the shop, folding chairs set up between the machines, exactly the way my father used to hold his Friday updates. I stood up to speak as the new head of the company. Denise walked in uninvited, in heels that clicked against the concrete floor of a shop she had never once set foot in during business hours in 4 years of marriage, and she stood in the doorway and announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I think everyone here deserves to know that Marcus is trying to push out the woman your boss loved for the last 4 years of his life. I dedicated myself to Harold. I deserve a place in what he built." The room went quiet. Not awkward quiet. Heavy quiet. The kind where you can hear the shop's ventilation system humming and nothing else. Then Rosa, the office manager who'd worked for my father for 19 years, stood up. Rosa had been in that hospital room with me more than once. Rosa had watched my father eat the meals I made and freeze in label containers. Rosa said, "Denise, I called you the night Harold had his first cardiac episode. You told me you'd come by when you could. You came by for 40 minutes. Marcus flew in that same night and didn't leave the hospital for 6 days. Nobody else said a word. Nobody had to." The silence after Rosa spoke did more work than any speech I could have given. Denise looked around the room, at 40 faces that had known my father for decades, that had watched the last 4 years happen in real time, and she understood, maybe for the first time, that everyone already knew exactly what she was. She turned and walked out. Her heels on that concrete floor were the loudest sound in the room, and then they weren't, and then it was just quiet again. She tried